Hello, everybody. I am Dr. Ira Kirschenbaum. I am the editor of the Journal of Orthopedic Experience and Innovation, frequently called JOEI, I believe pegged by Dr. Dasa, actually. And tonight we have a great journal club. It's based on an article that was written by Dr. Alok Sharan. Vinod Dasa is a guest here tonight with moderator, Dr. Matt Barber. I think unless you're under a rock on LinkedIn and anywhere else, you wouldn't know these three names. When you climb out of the rock, they're the first three you're going to see. I guess that's the best compliment I can give tonight. So I'm going to hand this over to Matt first, and when he runs out of questions from Alabama, the talkative New Yorker will take over.
Thanks, Ira. I appreciate it. And thank you again for creating JOEI and for these events and these journal clubs. I think they help a lot of folks. So we've got the two physician authors on this paper tonight, Dr. Dasa and Dr. Sharan. Maybe let's break up my first question between the two of you. I think probably most people participating in this have a pretty fair handle on the terms, but maybe Alok, why don't you start off if you would maybe tell us how you would define the key opinion leader, the KOL. What is that and what was that? And then we'll hit Ben up for what the DOL is.
Okay, well, thank you for that introduction. Ira, thanks again for putting this together. It's so cool to be part of such an innovative journal club. And Matt, thank you for asking me not to spell KOL as your first question. Yeah. I appreciate that. So I think the KOL, key opinion leaders, it's a really interesting phenomenon in healthcare. We know that influencers are really popular in the consumer world, and they can really influence what kind of jeans you buy, what kind of shoes to buy. The reality is in healthcare, we sort of follow the same thing. Key opinion leaders are people who are healthcare providers who we respect, people who we've read about in books and papers. And I know going through residency training, and even now, key opinion leaders are basically healthcare providers who are very thoughtful and whose opinions we respect, and ultimately may choose our implants or surgical technique based off of that. So ultimately, the key opinion leader is a healthcare provider who is well published, who draws a lot of authority and influence among other healthcare providers. That's my definition.
So Ben, what's the DOL and what's the difference?
So, if we reference back to the paper, key opinion leaders typically were academic ivory tower type people. Do a lot of research, we publish, and then you're on the podium or you've got posters or what have you. It was fairly undemocratized. I don't want this to sound pejorative, but somewhat elitist, where, if you're not in that kind of echelon, then you're not considered you're not considered a key opinion leader. And so if we transition and we think about how we're influenced traditionally, when Matt and I and Alok were med students and residents, that was who influenced decision-making, I think, in healthcare. You go to a conference, you go to the Academy or ACUS or ANA or whatever, and you've got these folks sitting at the podium saying, this is how you should think, or these are the things to consider. Maybe you want to do it this way, maybe you want to do it that way if you see X, Y, and Z. And there was a certain pedigree you had to be kind of at that level, influencing what people thought. So fast forward now, and we've got the internet and you've got social media, things are moving at a lightning pace. And digital opinion leaders, we're now starting to realize, can carry just as much influence. So, traditional KOLs came from academia or well-known institutions, and now you're seeing digital opinion leaders coming from all over the place. So you don't need to be from one of these, you don't have to be among this pedigree. You can essentially influence what people think almost instantaneously. You don't have to wait for a research paper. You don't put posters out. You don't have to, be invited to be on a podium. You're your thoughts and your frame of thinking right then and there is what people are gravitating towards and are appreciating. So it's somewhat of a democratization, I think, of who actually gets to influence and show people whatever way they think is appropriate. And so you're seeing this digital opinion leader, I think, become more and more prominent. And the time frame by which you can influence is, like exponentially greater than what we saw on the KOL side, where you have to write a paper. It gets months, if not years, to get published, and then you become established as a thought leader. Here, I mean, you get pretty much everyone here is here for a reason, right? You saw Ira post, or Joey post about this on LinkedIn, and how, if you look here, I forget how many people signed up for this. How many people would it take, and how long would it take to get this audience in the traditional KOL setting, right? Whether it's a dinner presentation or at a conference or what have you, versus in a DOL setting. Look at this, right? Within a week, with very little effort and very little acquisition costs, if you will, all of a sudden now you have people that are able to influence what people think and how they think.
Unquestionably, I think this is happening. I think this is a thing, and this is all of those things that you just talked about. So, to both of the authors, is that a good thing? It's happening. Period. Is it good?
I think so. I think that what we're seeing now is that more and more individuals have a voice now that can be heard. Perhaps in the past, it was really just let's say people from major academic programs that were basically influencing, but we know that there are good ideas out there that are happening outside of the academic institutions. And so someone from Alabama or someone in private practice in New Jersey, who's not necessarily on the stage a lot, may have a good idea about how to do a novel way of doing spine surgery. And with that, we're able to have a voice out there and people are able to hear it. And I think what's been really neat about this whole DOL movement is that perhaps you would only hear about ideas locally in your area or perhaps in the US, but now it's not uncommon that we're hearing about DOLs in other countries as well. And so I think what's so neat about this whole movement with the DOLs and how we're all connected with social media is that there's cross-pollination happening across international borders. And it's not uncommon. And I know from my personal experience that I hear about a lot of neat ideas about what people in Southeast Asia or South Asia are doing, how they're doing, let's say, spine surgery, or in Europe, how they handle these kind of protocols. So there's no question that the DOL movement is here. And I think the value of it is that it's giving a voice to people who normally don't have a voice.
And and I agree. I think the interesting thing about this phenomenon is you can decipher, the community decides, to your point, Matt, about what's good and what's bad, right? I feel like in the old model, you didn't really have the ability to decide. So let's say you put a post up, and we've seen crazy x-rays. You're like, what is that guy thinking? Or what's she thinking, right? You're like, oh my God, I wouldn't be caught dead doing something like that, right? But nonetheless, we as a community get to decide, what's appropriate, what's not. I mean, we're kind of crowdsourcing, if you will, the legitimacy of whatever that data or that information is, as opposed to in the traditional KOL sense, it's a 3-person panel at AUKUS or whatever that's deciding what's appropriate and what's not appropriate, who gets let in and who doesn't, and what ideas stick and what don't. Whereas in the digital setting, everything's up for grabs, right? Everything is appropriate. And then we get to essentially vote up or vote down what makes sense and what resonates. So, and it's done in real time. So I really think this is actually really good. It allows what works and what makes sense to get to the top in almost real time. And then what doesn't make sense, I mean, you'll see very quickly surgeons pouncing on something that makes absolutely no sense, right? Which is good. You're not going to get that at a meeting. You're not going to get that on the podium necessarily. Whereas here, and the converse of that, let's say Matt or Alok or somebody posts something, and a lot of surgeons are reading that post. And for example, let's say no one's liking it. So not that there's a negative, there's also no positive. So you get that reinforcement when Matt posts something about a cool technique or new implant or whatever, and you see a ton of surgeons liking it or commenting, that's great. That's impressive. If you're a company, how long would it take to get that feedback? And how much would that cost you? That's not cheap, right? You're getting that almost instantaneously because you've got a DOL that's putting information out there and it's getting validated, almost in real time. So I think it's really good, to be honest.
So I just
Well,
want to, but
even before you cross that over to the confluence with industry there, just devil's advocate here, because there is virtually no barrier to entry. I mean, your entry cost here is a phone and a willingness to put a picture or video on a platform. Do you have a concern about people being able to put out bad information?
That's a great question.
Alok, let me just interrupt for a second. I just want to let everyone know if you have questions, put them in the chat. And when there's a little break, I'll call on you to ask your question. Okay. Sorry about that, Alok.
No worries. Thank you. Matt, that's a great question. And at the end of the article, I think the last paragraph we wrote that basically it's great that there's a lot of good ideas out there, but I think as doctors, as healthcare providers, we've survived. We've gotten the respect of the layman because we have a whole peer review process that we don't put out information unless it has a p-value less than 0.05. That's what we are taught. I think that what's going to be interesting to see how this whole movement plays out is that how are we going to sort of do peer review on ourselves on a LinkedIn post, Facebook post, whatnot. I think as a community, if we want to continue to get the respect of the public, we're going to have to figure out how to provide credibility for all these posts. The crowdsourcing idea is really interesting because and how we're regulating ourselves. But in spine surgery right now, there's a little bit of controversy because pain management doctors are doing fusions and they're doing it various different ways. And it hasn't been necessarily qualified or studied if they should be doing it. And there's been a couple of pain doctors who put up some cases, and very quickly other spine surgeons responded saying, look, it's okay if you do fusions, but you need to think about A, B, C, and D, which they clearly didn't. And then very quickly that sort of subjugated that argument. So it's good. It's good that we put the information out there. It's good that we're all responding. But then I think as a community, we've got to decide how we're going to maintain our authority and sort of invoke like a peer review process for these posts.
I mean, I think it requires us, if we see garbage, we've got to speak up, right? I think we have to police ourselves and say, that's not appropriate, or this is, at least in our judgment. So in essence, you have a peer review process. If you're consuming this information, then I think it's incumbent upon you to look in the comments and look at the reactions to this. Don't take that post necessarily at face value and see if this person is a DOL, if you will, right? And then the next question is, how do you define DOL, or what are the metrics to say you are someone we should be believing or trusting versus somebody else that we shouldn't be?
There's a question from Aaron Wilkinson. Aaron, you want to unmute yourself and show us your video, or just unmute yourself and ask your question?
Is it okay if you just see my avatar?
Avatar's perfect.
Okay. Hey, Aaron Wilcoxon here. And first of all, thanks so much, Ira, for putting it on, and to the authors for writing it. I had one question related to content, which I didn't necessarily see addressed in the paper, and curious what your thoughts on it are. So specifically with KOLs of the past, primarily when they present on the podium, they're presenting the findings from research. So what I would determine are answers with just a little bit of space given to questions or limitations in the study, that kind of thing. It almost seems like the inverse to me when I anecdotally just scroll through on LinkedIn. It's a lot more questions and positing questions and fewer answers. And so I wonder, is that your experience? And how do you think about that just more generally? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, in my opinion, I think the traditional role of a KOL is morphing. So you're right. In the context of a conference or a meeting, we would present research and we would present answers to a hypothesis. Whereas in the digital space, it's almost like a micro version of that research, right? When you see one case presented of a loose implant or whatever it is, it's like a granular version of a more global research paper of 50 of those patients that we would have done research on. So I feel like the DOLs are answering issues and questions in real time that may not have otherwise be answered by research, right? It's because, we'll post x-rays or patient issues, and odds are there's probably not a lot of research to answer a lot of the things that get posted on social media. And then potentially that drives research, which then moves into the KOL realm and gets presented at a meeting or what have you. So I think they're two different roles between a KOL and DOL. And I think the point of the paper was both are important, both are influential. But now on the DOL side, digital opinion leader side, the issues they're addressing and the problems they're solving haven't been done before. So they have a different role.
Yeah, it's a great question, Aaron. I think that what the struggle is it's a question of the speed of innovation. So you have a paper, you do a research study, you either publish it or you present it at an annual meeting. So by the time that information is presented at the meeting, it could be old. By the time it's published, it could be old. And that's okay. But then when you post fairly new information up on social media and hasn't gone through this rigorous peer review process, at least you get the information out there. There's no good answer for this, but I think that there's no question that when the KOL is presenting on the podium, it's going to go through a more rigorous process before it's presented, versus the DOL, it's not. But on the flip side, what it's going to allow is the speed of innovation. And we're going to be able to get more innovative ideas out there. And I think that that's always going to be a struggle. It's always going to be a debate, but I think it's a good thing because, traditionally innovations take about 17 years to get widespread adoption in healthcare. That's what the data says. I think now with the DOLs, you're going to see that the speed of innovation is going to be much faster.
It's great. I just have a quick question. I was speaking to a very brilliant healthcare consultant earlier today who made the following comment, that there's been adoption of a tremendous number of clinical products with a very small amount of clinical data. And that brings up the point that you can really push a product pretty heavily in the DOL space, right? And people could start adopting it because you're showing a picture of it. Sort of like the old joke that George Carlin used to say that, the acne medicine you got on the back of the cereal box worked because they showed a picture of someone with dots on their face, and then they showed a picture of someone with no dots on their face. So you knew it worked. And that's sometimes, we look at JOEI as sometimes a peer-reviewed LinkedIn, because we get things out fast. But separately, a DOL can take an idea and push it strong enough, and it leads to maybe good things, but sometimes some people don't call out certain powerful DOLs. What do you guys think about that idea?
We've got to design a system where we could do that. Yeah.
I think that gets back to Ben's point that when you're crowdsourcing it, the ability to call people out is instantaneous. And a lot of the historical KOLs were, they were on a podium. They were deeply involved with industry. They had a lot of things that sort of kept them in that spot. And the internet is not so merciful in some ways. So maybe that's to Vin's point.
And Ira, we've seen people on the podium, KOLs. They'll have a research paper on X, Y, and Z, and then they get off the podium. You ask them, "What do you do in your practice?" And they're like, "Oh, well, I do A, B, and C." I'm like, "Well, you just got up there and told us X, Y, and Z is better. You're doing this." So it happens on the traditional side, and to your point, you can lead people astray too on the digital side as well. Yeah. But on the KOL side, you had very little ability to challenge. Right? How many people would get up at a microphone in the middle of AUKUS with all your peers and challenge, a big name up there, right? Versus here on the digital side, there's some value in the impersonality of of digital where you don't feel, I guess, as scared or as worried, if you want to criticize or question what's going on.
We have another question from the audience for a second. Masha Domanis, you had a question?
Yeah, so I think touched on, Ira, the theme that you had just brought up, but how for those of you in the digital realm and who are now interacting not just with your peers, but interacting with the product companies, the OEMs, how conscientious are you of what you're sharing, what you're promoting, and how you're interacting with the brand ambassador, the brands and their ambassadors, and what that implication is for your practice?
I'm very conscientious about it, and I'm very careful to not lose credibility. And I don't want to be seen as a commercial or as a Pied Piper for something. So I'm very cautious. So for example, if you've seen some of the videos I put about the patient recovery and things like that, I don't really specify any particular thing, product that I'm doing. And I'm very careful. If I do mention a product, I'll put something, I'll put a disclaimer in there, please see my profile for any COIs. So I think for me, at least, when interacting or mentioning companies that I have a conflict with, I think it's extremely important that we maintain transparency because I want to keep my credibility. You don't necessarily become someone that people believe if they think you're tricking them.
So think about that though, and cross that back to a historical KOL model. Really, with those KOLs, the same people are the people that you trusted. They were real trustworthy and real consistent at meetings across multiple years. They were the same on the podium as they were at a dinner meeting. They were willing to help. They were open, and they built that trust in the same way. Similarly, there were people that only talked heavily about particular products. And I think people pretty quickly get the feel of I'm being sold, even if they were in that more traditional KOL model. So I think you're exactly right, Vin, is keeping that trust and that reputation, because I mean, even in the digital space, there are people that when they post, I know what's coming, because it's always the same stuff, and you're not a leader at that point.
And
I've seen some people. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I've seen some people now putting up their disclosures on their LinkedIn posts, which I think is respectable, and we'll probably evolve to that too. And I think that's something that we're going to, again, as a community, we should decide before the government does, and say that yes, when we do a post, we should put up our disclosures, especially if there's a conflict.
And as a consumer, everyone here, we all consume this digital content. If you see a physician promoting something and it's blatant and they don't put some kind of disclaimer or COI or something in there, you should start probably dropping them on your rank of people that you necessarily want to believe or be influenced or listen to. If I see blatant promotion and there's not that transparency, I start discounting that person. At least and that's my personal opinion.
All right.
I think Kevin's raising his hand.
Kevin, you got it.
So I really am fascinated, and I really appreciate Matt, Alok, and Vin. Time solves problems. So I would like to go against you to say that while it's exciting and social media has some role in this world, although I'd like to see Mark Zuckerberg faint, time solves. So when you read that article, and it's interesting you're all comparing KOLs and DOLs when they're just plain folk getting up on the stage, that I could take double bundle ACL. You say, well, Freddie can get that result, bless his soul, but I couldn't. And so I just say that I think there is a role for time. And so I agree with you. It's great to bring innovation, but no different than private equity. You get 10 deals they try to get one deal that's successful in their life because they know 9 are crap and going to crap out. I wonder if bringing things so fast, besides exciting some others, brings those that are vulnerable to our patients too fast. And so I think there is a role for caution, and I'll bow to Greg. I love it, but on the other hand, I'm fearful because many things don't make a difference over time. And I am guilty as one, I will say it, of being, I'm not a laggard on that curve that we say. You're an early adopter. Are you there in the middle? Are you a laggard? I admit I'm pretty early on many things as long as I try them out, but I worry sometimes because I can't touch you on the stage. I can't look you in the eye, and your Snapchat or whatever it is faking your makeup. And so you look too good. And I wonder about it. Sorry.
Yeah, I
So-
mean, Kevin, I agree with you to a certain extent, right? I mean, we want to be deliberate. If you're, but ultimately the burden, I think, is on the practitioner.
Absolutely.
If they're just going to follow the next fad, that's on you. I mean, we have plenty of instances where we were extremely deliberate, and what all metal, pick your thing. I mean, went through the entire process, and still we found problems.
Well,
right?
and that speaks to the ability to make things fail faster that need to fail. And bear in mind too, even in publications and what gets published, there are some biases in certain areas and some conflicts of interest that are not spoken about, but that are very, very large at some of the journals. Without going into a name, I can think of one or more implants in the last few years that were failing consistently by the same mechanism, that if you were waiting for it to be in JOEI, it was never going to happen. And if you didn't know somebody that would tell you about that and what they were seeing, it was going to be a long time. You knew that, and you may have been doing something that you didn't want to be doing in that situation. And that connectivity and that rapid fire communication does source some of those things, sort of what Ben was saying of being able to immediately call certain things out.
But to your point, Kevin, I think that the question I ask is the peer review process, which is what we've relied on to get to the truth, is that really a good method to get to the truth? Or is it better to put up a post and see if you get 20 thumbs up and 2 thumbs down? And you essentially allow a crowd to get to that. Because again, that's nothing against Freddie Fu, but when Freddie Fu would make a statement, for a variety of different reasons, he had the brand authority as well as the academic authority, but has never been tested beyond that. And
Right.
so was that really the best way to get to the truth? And I would argue now that we're in first generation right now with social media and healthcare, meaning that we're just getting exposed to this. This is a technology platform. The second generation is going to be to start quantifying your authority, right? If you consistently get 20 likes, or do you get 2 thumbs down? And we'll be able to, at some point, some smart person will come up with a better scoring mechanism to see what is Kevin Plancher's impact score. Is it real, right? Eventually we'll get to that point. And so then I believe that we'll actually be able to measure someone's credibility with some meaningful data as a second or third generation idea.
I think you're correct. And the bias in the journals, when 2 people say one thing and one person says another, and that they have bias, it's absolutely there. That's why it is a problem. And I like that you say there are others. I fear others outside our community will interpret things. I did an ACL yesterday, and going into the operating room after many pre-op visits and things which we do in our office, he said, "You know what? Why don't we change to do a quad instead of both telebone?" 20 seconds before I'm about to wheel into the operating room. Okay. I failed, therefore, in communication. And I thought I did a great job to explain it beforehand. But when did you read? Oh, I read last night, in Google. This is how you do it. And all my friends said, you don't get knee pain. You jump higher in basketball. You do all this. So sometimes I think we do a little of a disservice sharing some of this information. I haven't figured it out yet, but that's why I like the conversation.
I'd like to introduce Cory Calendine just joined us. Cory, you around there?
Pleasure to be with you all. Really, I have no idea why I'm here other than to listen. Already, I learned so much. I don't think I even knew you could do an ACL with the quad. So there you go, Dr. Blanchard. We didn't cover that. I went to Vanderbilt, down south.
I see.
They're a little slow down there. It's okay.
Get that robot. I love you.
That's exactly right. No, listen, I think you all are hitting on some really interesting concepts. I really appreciated that we're in the first generation of this tier. Obviously there are guys here that, do a lot in different platforms and in different ways, which is kind of cool. But I thought the comment in the, in the chat, I guess you call it, was really strong. So much about being a digital opinion leader is not about you're the only source of all knowledge. It's about how do you connect with people and begin a conversation. When we start looking at a blue check or whatever, we're all biased in some, play, but who are those people willing to step forward and say, it's about the patients, this is an important conversation, and who's willing to have that conversation in a public setting? I think that's where the real power is.
And from the article too, I think you're exactly right, Cory. And I think that was Patrick. We didn't talk about one of your points in the article was that it's not siloed by subspecialty either. Right. So when you get into a digital space, if I'm talking about knee replacement, it's not just knee replacement surgeons. There's engineers, there's people in industry, there's physical therapists. It crosses disciplines in a way that most of our traditional models don't.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, obviously I do hip and knee replacement. I have like 2 procedures. I know all the jokes, but in fairness, I learned some incredible things about knee replacement from my more senior partner, who was one of these guys that kind of did everything, but classically trained in sports. Even that interaction we don't do good with. Me and hip and knee replacement, I go to AUKUS. That's where I go. And, we'll see where Academy falls in here, guys, where we all kind of come together. I know several of you guys were there. I was. But in the digital space, we can do it year round, which is really cool. And across subspecialties, but obviously other disciplines as well.
Greg, did you have a question or statement?
Well, I was just going to comment on the that I don't think the peer review process is still very good, because the latest JOEI, there was an article on liposomal bupivacaine decreases pain in hip fracture patients. Anybody read that article? So you've looked at liposomal bupivacaine, you find that every article where it's successful, they compare it against Tylenol or something. When every trial where they compare it against just plain old bupivacaine, there's no difference. And so I find it curious that JOEI is publishing that article. The other thing that's interesting in the results is that liposomal bupivacaine did better than liposomal bupivacaine and IV Tylenol. That's just a nonsensical result. I mean, how is that better than that itself plus IV Tylenol? Anyway, but it was just published in JOEI. So peer reviewed, published, and nobody's looking at the comparators and the bias that's introduced in that kind of a study.
And I would argue, I think that the other question that has to be asked is our current clinical trial process the right way of doing it as well? Because the clinical trial processes are in an ideal situation as opposed to doing real world evidence. And so then the question is it better, how many times do you do a clinical trial, you get a result, and then 10 years later, when you look at that technology, does it match up to the original clinical trial data? I would argue that for med devices, it doesn't. So what I like about the DOL movement is the great equalizer, is that it's allowing the crowd to determine if, if what you said with peer review or clinical trial was actually true. The crowd basically will decide.
And Greg, think about this, right? That if something goes directly to publication, there's no AUKUS podium, there's no nothing, so you can't get up to a mic or anything. Here's a DOL, you're essentially coming up to the mic at a meeting, and on internet, when JOS put the thing up, you could have very easily gone on there and put your critique down, right?
Well, I agree completely. Yeah.
And so that's, I think, the role of the DOL is to call attention to, you're a credible, believable person, right? And an authority in this space. So this whole digital movement provides in real time the ability for us to police and monitor what we otherwise couldn't have done, right?
Yep.
So I think it's a powerful role if you really take advantage of it.
The Academy's not very happy though, because they get a lot of advertising dollars from Exparel.
Yeah, but Greg, you can call out a bunch of different companies, right? Whether it's Exparel or an implant or whatever, right? So, where are you going to draw the line?
Well, I think Greg brings up a very good point, which in a sense, somehow you get a feeling when you've been in some academics for a while and then you move out, you feel that the fix is in. What I mean is, what's going to be published in certain journals. You know how it's going to be said. You know which people are going to publish it. Okay. I mean, I'm not going to. I mean, I trained at the Rothman Institute, and I feel like some of these journals might as well be called, the annals of whatever, KOLs there are. It's sometimes, there's so much institutional bias that we're fighting against. And right now, and I agree with Kevin a lot, right now it's refreshing to see this democratization on various media, but as it matures, there will be some people who will most probably figure out a way how to game the system a little bit more aggressively than others.
Yeah, there's no question that's going to be the case, but I think that the crowd will sort of be the peer review.
Okay.
All right, I think we got some questions in the chat.
Yeah, there are a few there. So let me start off with Jerry Ennett. Jerry, you want to say something?
Yeah, thank you. I was just wondering, it seems like LinkedIn is the kind of the forefront in terms of surgeons building brand awareness and just awareness in general in the industry. I know Dr. Calendine's had success on Instagram as well. Is there data on if you reach as many patients on LinkedIn versus Instagram? Do you feel like Instagram will become more popular for surgeons as they try to reach more patients, as it reaches a bit of a younger audience, maybe more patients as opposed to just other industry professionals, or how do you see that trending?
Yeah, we didn't detail that as much. It's a great question. I think that each platform would have a different strategy. So LinkedIn is sort of like a B2B strategy. So if your goal is to get to other, let's say, physicians, and you're trying to build a brand to get to other physicians, let's say you're trying to put on a course or whatnot, LinkedIn would work. If you're looking for sort of a B2C strategy, Cory can talk about this more, but Instagram and TikTok would be better. Twitter seems to be a great place for conversations. And actually, in terms of just healthcare conversations, Twitter, well, up till recently, I think, Twitter was the most common platform for having healthcare conversations. But it depends on what your strategy is. And are you trying to do a B2B or B2C approach?
Sean Patel, new deputy editor of JOEI. Sean, you had a question about institutional consent and a variety of other things in that space.
Yeah, thank you, Ira. For those of you that are posting clinical cases, aside from removing any patient identifying information, are you obtaining any institutional or patient consent for posts? And Secondarily, have you encountered or heard of any medical legal issues that resulted from social media posts regarding clinical cases?
So for me, as long as, so a few things. Number one, in my posts, I go to great pains to remove any type of identifying information. I don't include faces or anything like that. And all my patients, when I do have a social media consent signed, that we have in their, that we put in their chart and those kinds of things. As far as the institutional approval, if I do mention the institution in my post, then yes, they'll jump on me. So I rarely will mention the institution. So it basically is my post, if you will. So that's how I typically handle it. And I haven't seen or heard of any medical legal issues.
Good point. Good point. Patrick Maiden, as a vendor, you had a number of questions. Yeah.
Well, Ira, the first one was really just a comment as compared to just being at a conference and watching somebody do a presentation up front, because the digital platform allows us to actually interact and watch the interaction between different surgeons and see people asking questions. I've only really been to one, maybe a second conference where watching a panel discussion, then people could get up and challenge them. And I'll give some praise there to Dr. Plancher, because obviously OSET was the one where that was the case. But to be able to see the discussion and the discussion of which technique might have been better, which things did you try? And then from the vendor perspective, being able to see, even interact with them, I'll kind of tie my two together. Interacting with Dr. Dasa and Dr. Barber and Dr. Plancher and yourself and even Dr. Calendine on LinkedIn made me a whole lot more comfortable once I was actually around them in person, which I've been obviously down in Vin's area. And then met Dr. Plancher as well. And then Dr. Barber and I shared a flight, and it was just like a quick, hey, yeah, I realize who you are. Enjoy the flight. But it makes it easier and more comfortable for me to go up and ask questions to these guys. And to be able to not feel like I'm getting looked at like the random idiot in the room coming to ask a question, as opposed to I can actually have a discussion about not only what I do, but what they do and how the stuff that I have might interact or work in their practice or not work in their practice. And I even picked out Dr. Calendine's pizza the other night while we were at your meeting.
I think we're more scared of you, Patrick. You're a big guy.
I am a large guy, so yeah, I can't argue that.
And to Patrick's point, I think industry is still very scared and trying to figure this out. I'm sure their compliance departments watching them like hawks. But I think it's an opportunity for industry to really test ideas and test concepts and things like that. I know the reps and most everyone for the company are petrified and told not to even say hello on social media. But if we had some kind of mechanism where we can bring forward ideas, concepts, and things in a not in a commercial way, right? But genuinely in a constructive, creative way, I think that would help. So I think the relationship with industry and DOLs is going to mature over time, and we've tried to find that balance of, if Patrick calls me and says, "Hey, can you talk about this idea?" Do we talk about it at a very generic, high level, or are we promoting something specific to the company that he works for? In which case, maybe we approach it differently. But Patrick and or whomever from these companies, I think, really have interesting concepts and ideas, and I think it's a great way to get kind of feedback and understand kind of what the market is and what the opportunities are.
All right, that was good pause for a second. That's pretty good. I've never seen so many surgeons so quiet all of a sudden. It's great. Some other comments from Alok. What do you feel about, again, the idea of the increasing influence? Or one of the questions was someone talked about an impact factor. Will we be able to really, who was this? Marty Nichols. You had that question.
Yeah. Yeah, I put the question out and a statement before. I think one of the neat things for me about the DOL versus the KOL too is, as a longtime industry, some of the KOLs started getting this image, that doctors are only in it for the money, and so they publish and they want to speak, for money. They go to dinners to get a free dinner. And one of the things the digital aspect has proven is just how passionate all of you guys are for what you do, that you're taking time on your own time in the evening to discuss your craft and your trade, with other people. And I think it's a true testament to all of you. And earlier, a statement was made, I think, Dr. Dasa, you made the statement talking about that you could see a different impact score than just the thumb up or thumb down within the deal. And that kind of intrigued me. Do you see a day, will the digital media and digital leadership aspect get to a point where not only we could see a different impact score of the physician, whether they're impacting their peers, but will there be a way to actually tie that to their outcomes, to where you can see not only was this DOL an impactor within their industry, but did they actually get a good outcome with it as well?
I think that's going to take long, and that's probably going to be challenging, right? To what your digital metric is, and then correlate that with your KOOS score or PROMIS score or something like that. But to get your hands around quantifying the metrics around the DOL, we have in the paper, we put some metrics that as authors we thought would be important to consider in terms of measuring the impact of a DOL. And I'll just list them right here. So we put for number one, number of followers; number two, number of followers who are a healthcare provider; number of views, which is obvious; number of likes; number of times the content is reshared. This is a measure of quality. Number of comments represents engagement, and the frequency that a DOL is tagged or mentioned in another post. So those are, and if you look in the paper, those are kind of maybe a starting point to figure out, how do we objectively measure the value that someone is producing online.
But it should be also said that if you look at the pharmaceutical world, they're probably 10 years ahead of us when you compare it to the med device world. And so like Pfizer and those companies have really realized the value of DOLs. You probably heard that they've got, I think Pfizer got rid of half their sales force, forgot the exact number, because they realized that the DOLs who talk about their drugs are more influential overall, and they track that really well. And they've even done studies where they've probably correlated to sales, I'm sure. There's probably a business model around all that. So the pharmaceutical world has already started quantifying the value of DOLs, and what they're trying to figure out is how they can use the influence of DOLs to promote their products. In the med device world, we just haven't gotten to that point yet.
Mark Maloney, you had a comment which I think is worth mentioning to everyone.
Hey, thanks a lot. I appreciate it. I run a regulatory compliance company, then we're in over 1,100 medical practices. I think it's just as scary to raise your hand at a meeting as, for a doctor as maybe it was when we were in high school. I did an interview recently with a very high volume surgeon. And he told me, he said, I raised my hand a couple of times. I expressed some opinions. I felt laughed at because I'm not an academic KOL, at a big university. I think social media and the opportunity to be a DOL will give someone like that a voice. I think that is just great. That's my comment.
And Mark, I think that I agree with you 100%. That's why the speed of innovation is going to be so different now, because you're going to have people. I used to be in academics and now I'm in private practice, and I've been absolutely amazed at how good some private practice doctors are compared to the academic world, and they just don't have a chance to publish what they're doing. But I've learned a lot from surgical technique wise from some very good private practice doctors.
And what's fascinating, if you look on LinkedIn, for example, however you define DOL, how many of those are traditionally KOLs from a large academic institution? Like, if you look at everyone here on this panel, none of us are at, name your fancy university. And, I would argue that, Matt and Cory and Alok have probably influenced and made people think differently and have done a lot online that I would argue maybe even more than what a KOL would have done at a meeting. And whether it's influencing patients, influencing other specialties, other disciplines, right? So I think it's not just one another in terms of physicians or people within your subspecialty, but it's influencing the community, I think, is actually more impactful and showing what's possible. And it's fascinating to me that none of the kind of traditional KOLs in the typical ivory towers have transitioned over here, because I think this is actually more powerful than our traditional model that we've all grown up with.
Ryan Van Poefelen. Ryan, I hope I pronounced your last name right. Ryan, you had a comment?
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I just wanted to reiterate, it's Van Pufflin. That's okay. It's a long one.
It's not like Kirschenbaum or anything. It's okay.
Of course. The point, just from an industry perspective, is, it's nice to be able to make connections with people that, normally I would not be able to, right? So I'm on the diffuse synthese side of the house. Having a coffee with Dr. Calendine might be a bit of a challenge at 5 years ago, but LinkedIn connections and the ability to connect with several of you thought leaders is just incredible, right? And to be able to do it on the fly and in a more kind of casual, get to know you, non-pressure selling kind of environment is really refreshing. So appreciate your efforts, and just wanted to check in and say hello.
Ryan, I really think that's the point is, I think we're all better because of it. I can't remember the company that you said you worked for, but I'm teasing, Ryan. It's a joke. Listen, I think we have done ourselves a very significant disservice by being too siloed. Dr. Dasa mentioned, the classic KOLs have not, involved in this space. I think because this space is different. This space is more like, hey, jump in the pool and see what happens. Maybe that's just, I'm not smart enough to be afraid of the deep end. But actually, I think in the deep end with all of us together is how we're really going to win. And it's the speed of innovation that we keep talking about. It's the speed of connections, Ryan. I really enjoyed several conversations since the first coffee. That's why this space is different. And that's why it's really on all of us to be involved in the conversation.
No, it's perfect. Perfect.
Hey, can I jump in? This is Mike Cusick. I just following
Mike,
up.
yeah, sure. Yeah.
I'm just, observing, and as I've observed on LinkedIn, you kind of hit on there. The DOL, it turns into a conversation. It's a KOL, it's more intimate, it's a small group, if you will. Whereas a KOL, as everyone's talked about, it's a presentation, it's didactic, you can't really ask questions or challenge it. Whereas, the DOL experience is opening it up really to be a learning experience all the way around.
So, and those existed sometimes with KOLs, but it was at the table after the presentation was over. For me and Ira, it was Tony Headley with 2 glasses of wine in him at dinner after the presentation, when the real truth came out and the gut reactions and what was really going on.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, same industry side, right? We have those conversations at a dinner table. We've never had them, industry doesn't speak up at the formal meetings. And so again, it's reminding me very much of that scenario.
Well, and industry's missing a ton of value too, because historically, they've paid a ton of money to designers and consultants that give those presentations, and then they go back to being invisible. Whereas, look at Cory. Yeah, there's going to be a presentation, there's going to be something, but it's the interaction, it's all the time, and they're massively undervaluing that.
Yeah, well, and someone mentioned it earlier. I'm not with one of the large corporations anymore, but anyone at the large corporations doesn't really know how to behave in this world, and is probably very fearful of having any, of saying the wrong thing or putting themselves out there.
It'll evolve. I think the market's going to force that, as companies start realizing. Obviously in the retail space, you see it left and right. But I think, again, to Alok's point, we're in the infancy. We're in the first inning here. And so the rules and regs and etiquette and all that kind of stuff, I think is going to evolve. I think the market will force it.
We're sort of towards the end. I'd like to get some final comments from each of our four DO experts. Maybe we'll start with Alok, and then Cory, and then Matt again, and then Vin. You'll back forth. Yeah.
Clean up. I think that this, first of all, thank you for accepting our article. I know it wasn't necessarily you, Ira, but the DOL movement is here to stay. Our goal in publishing the topic was not only to bring to light the fact that there are DOLs, but I think as a community, if we want to maintain our respect, we have to start coming up with standards now. So this conversation was exciting, and I hope that basically this started leading to some kind of standards that we can all sort of come up with on what is proper behavior for a DOL. Should they, present their consulting contracts, whatever. But I think this is great, and this is just the beginning of a conversation about where we need to go to maintain our authority as healthcare providers.
Wait, Cory?
Well, again, high respect to the paper submitted, to bringing forward this conversation. I think it's fascinating. We've talked around this a little bit, where industry's trying to figure it out. I think because they know it's so powerful, they're going to be somewhat slow to it. But it really is on all of us who are interested, who are starting the conversation, to do it and do it well as a conversation, as being transparent, available. And honestly, I'm kind of fangirling about a lot of guys on the call. So I'm just honored to be with you. Thank you.
Good. Matt?
This is like Jeff Bezos, where your margin is my opportunity. And the opportunity here is because a lot of the same reason that JOEI is a thing is because a lot of our traditional outlets have weaknesses in terms of access, of getting ideas out, getting them out quickly. And even like Alok said, I mean, there historically were some KOLs that if you knew other KOLs and really influential people, they would tell you that guy's really not a great surgeon, but a big name and a big publisher. And so this lets that guy that's in private practice doing 800, 1,000 really great cases a year get his ideas out there. And the format's changing too. Video changes all of that, the ability to see techniques in short snippet videos and to digest something that way rather than having to see it rendered in drawings in a journal is huge.
Good. Vin, you'll go and then I'll wrap up.
Yeah, thanks, Ira. And again, thanks everybody for listening in. I think this is kind of a fascinating space. It's extremely powerful. I didn't really understand it when I first started posting, getting involved, and to see what the people I've been able to meet and the things I've been able to learn and the interactions and relationships I've built has been pretty phenomenal and impressive. I'm excited to see what the future holds. I think we're, again, just starting off in its infancy. And as this matures and we get better and better at this, I think everyone on this call, you're here for a reason. You're listening to this because this is kind of what the future is. And I think the people listening here are the first movers. If we understand how to take advantage of this and get our hands around it, I think we will be really impactful.